So I've loved all of those answers, and that's what I was picking up last night, that of a room full of people who've had that beautiful experience of touching their own true self just for a moment. That's what that is to me. Okay? A moment when you move beyond when Sid talked for years about going inside, that's really what he meant. Going to a place within that exists before our learning, before our intellect, before our experience, before our habits, before our belief systems. And that feeling that we got is it's the living evidence that we touched our true selves, right? That we've had that experience of getting inside before everything else. And to me, that's when I went home last night after talking to so many of you last night, I just had this amazing feeling that we have a room full of people that have had that experience. And you see, that experience and that feeling, in the end, will be the only thing that carries Sid's vision forward. I'm not saying that it's not valuable to have a lot of people out there with courses and the internet and all the connections and all. I mean, that's beautiful too, because it's getting that understanding out there in the world. But the real force lies in people who are touched at a deep enough level that everybody around them sees something different. See, that's been the catalyst for change from day one on this island, and it keeps repeating itself. Let's think about it for a minute. Why would anybody listen to a welder with a 9th grade education talk about the meaning of life? Why? Yeah, really ask yourself, why? And there's really only one explanation, is that he spoke from that certainty, right? And when he spoke from that certainty, he wasn't speaking to you or me. He was speaking to the person behind the mask, soul to soul. And that's what touched people. And then the proof that existed in the very beginning is the same thing that keeps reoccurring. The only reason the first people who listened to Sid listened was just because the change in him was so phenomenal, right? Family couldn't even recognize him. People he worked with actually passed him in the street after he had his experience. His way of being, his way of carrying himself, the way that he talked had changed so totally overnight that people were stunned to see that change. And that's why people began to get curious. And in my book, it always goes like this: confusion, curiosity, listening, hearing. That's the way it works to me. And when somebody changes that much in such a powerful and permanent way, it creates a wonderful form of confusion, right? And we want that confusion, because that confusion is breaking up. Like, I always thought I knew how the world was constructed and what I was in it, until I listened to Sid Banks, and I realized I didn't have a clue. Actually, not even until I listened to Sid Banks. Until my wife changed so much after meeting Sid Banks that I got really confused. No, really, because we'd been searching for years and years and years. And I won't even go into the efforts, hours and hours and hours sitting in weird positions in the Zendo and reading this and reading that. And oh God, Sid used to laugh so hard when I tell him stories about what we did at the Zendo. He would just kill himself laughing. And then something happened that I'd never seen before, right? And that is, one day my wife came home and she was a different person. Not just a little bit different, but totally different in terms of how she looked, how she responded to me, how she was in the world, how she was with our son, right? And that confused me beyond belief. I was so confused. What is this, In my logical, intellectual mind, there was no way for me to make sense of that, Did you do a new practice? Did you have a new meditation? Did you have a new, did you read something? Did you do something totally different than what we've done before. No, I talked to this welder for half an hour. Yeah. Now, see, that's confusing. That's really confusing, you know? But that confusion saved my life. Right? Because I was so sure about how this world was constructed. I was so sure of how broken I was. I was so sure of what I should be ashamed of in this life. I was so sure that my life was going to end in tragedy, honestly. That's where I was. And I was sure, as sure as I am now, but about all the wrong things. And when Jan came home that day, I shifted into confusion, and I hated it, you know, and I certainly wasn't interested in what some welder on Salt Spring Island was saying, you know, especially because I knew he'd never read anything. You know, he'd never been to India, he'd never been to Japan, he'd never been to the Far East, you know. I mean, what are you talking about? What do you mean you talk to this guy for half an hour? It's just bizarre, you know. But that confusion slowly settled into curiosity. Right? And it was a reluctant curiosity. Right? But I couldn't help myself. Because I had really been searching. I did want to find something, you know. And in that reluctant curiosity, I finally saw something. I finally listened to something beyond what I thought I already knew. Right? And when that happened, everything in our lives changed absolutely and totally. And that's the same thing that's happened with all of you, see? And so that pattern, I love thinking and talking about that pattern of change, confusion, curiosity, listening, and insight has continued to repeat itself in so many different environments and with so many different people, but it's always the same. Like, I started out working in business. I was an HR manager in a heavy manufacturing plant for a few years. And then I went consulting with business relative to the principles, right? But I can honestly say that in every successful program that we had, it was the change in the first 2 or 3 people that drove those projects, that drove what happened in those projects, you know. I mean, the examples, I mean, we have had the most fascinating and interesting life. I sit here right now and think, how was that possible? How did that happen, you know? But we saw people, we'd sit down with 15 executives for 3 days who were stressed and worried and insecure and upset and so on and so forth. Not all of them, but many of them. And we would tell our story, and we would slowly start to talk about the state of mind that was available if they understood who and what they were and where this all came from, you know. Now, we would back into it at first. It was not something we just, hey, let me tell you about these 3 principles. We didn't do that, you know, but we backed into it. But we always ended up talking about what truly was, you know. And when that first 1 or 2 or 3 people would change, it would shock everybody. I can remember we worked with this entertainment company, and one of the executives was a very hardened guy. I mean, his language was hard, his way of carrying himself was hard, his way of interacting with other people was, I mean, just unbelievable. He would just tear people apart in front of everybody else. He just was that kind of personality who, he actually said to me at one point he believed that fear was the most important factor in managing people. No, that was his belief, you know. And he came, Jan and I did a program with him, a 3-day retreat. The owner of the company was so concerned about the environment and what was going on and how people weren't getting along that he asked us to do this retreat, right? Well, this man did not want to be there. In fact, he made some comment to me in the hall before we started about he didn't believe in this charm school, he just had to be here. You know? But I'll be there anyway, but I just want you to know, you know. And so we set out talking about what we understood, and we had interviewed, Jan and I had interviewed like 130 people, right, in the company. at all levels of management and some employees. So we had a pretty good picture, a well-rounded picture, I would say. And we backed into it and started talking about state of mind, and we started to get some positive responses, but this guy was like this through the whole thing, all 3 days. And I thought, well, that's too bad, but you can't win them all. I was okay with that. On the last day, this guy walked in, and his physical change was so phenomenal. Honestly, I knew it the second he walked in. And we all sat down, and everybody was looking at him because they could see something had really happened with this guy, right? And it was very simple. He was trying to ignore us as best he could, right? But he was about to divorce his wife of not that many years. I think even though he was older, I think they'd only been married 10 years or something like that. And on the drive home on the second night of this 3-day retreat, he just had this absolutely amazing insight that everything that was going on between he and his wife was thought. And that they'd had this love before. And they'd had a beautiful relationship in the beginning, and he started to it really hit him that he could have everything he wanted. That it was just a bad dream. And those were the words he used, that it was a bad dream, right? And we started the session on the third day, and I asked people for, like we do here, for their responses to the couple of days that we'd had. And he put up his hand, and I was shocked. I actually thought he was just going to give me a hard time, But he couldn't get it out. His chin was shaking. He was trying to get his bearings, and he just shared that experience that he'd had on his way home from work, from the retreat, right? So long story short, he goes back into the work environment at that point, and there's a buzz going through the place. There's 3,500 employees in this place, right? Pretty much under one roof, right? And the buzz about him was huge. Everywhere he went, people couldn't figure out what was going on. The way that he started interacting with people was like what we used to call in our talks in business being in service, like listening and helping and serving and settling people down and asking what he could do. It was so counter to people's experience with him that the following retreats, as we moved through the organization, our work was done. Literally, our work was done. All we had to do was, what happened to so-and-so? Well, let me tell you, And again, that one example confused hundreds of people. It did. It confused hundreds of people. And then those hundreds of people, and particularly in the management group, became curious. And when they became curious, they were interested in listening to something they'd never heard before. And when they listened to something they'd never heard before, they started having insights. And the whole corporation began to change. Now, this is just us telling one story about our work in business, and I know hundreds of people that are doing this in business and getting the same kinds of impacts, okay? So here we are. Sid Banks has an experience. He changes so phenomenally that people around him finally begin to look at it. They don't know what it is to begin with. They really don't, So we go to that business and many, many more. And one person, two persons, three persons change at a level that you said that, who was it said they saw other people change so much? It was you, yeah. That happened in that way. If Elsie was here, she would tell you about people that she saw change in the homeless community, right? And the businesses she worked in. And then we go to the prison system that Jan and I worked in for 3 years in Florida. And I know that the revolution that happened in the prison that we worked in happened because of 3 women, one in particular. Okay, the first day that we started, okay, we were escorted in and went through all of the security stuff and everything. Jacqueline, you know what that's like. And brought to a training room, and there was 3 women standing at the door who were their job was to greet us, 3 inmates, right? Their demeanor was bent over, basically staring at their shoes. I mean, you could see shame floating off them like a cloud. You could feel it, you know. And they were so kind. They were doing their best, but they couldn't look at us. Not one of them could really look at us, but they were doing their best. They greeted us. They showed us into the training room, and they'd done a lovely job of setting things up and setting the room up and everything. And again, we shared what we understand. We started with our story, what happened to us. And it was really funny at first because at the time this was going on, Jeb Bush was the governor in Florida. And his idea of helping inmates recover and be suitable for society, and I'm not knocking these people, but his idea of doing that was only to have faith-based programs. So at that time, most embetterment programs and training programs in the prison system had been stripped out, and there was just pretty much religion all day, you know. And one of the reasons we got to do our program was the ACLU was about to sue them, the prison system, because they were forcing religion on people who were incarcerated, right? So that's partly how we got in. But the inmates don't know this, so they think we're preachers. They're waiting for the sermon, you know? And they were like, what? What? And you know, what church do you belong? Well, we don't. You know, you don't? You know? And so that was kind of fun, you know. They really thought we were there. We were going to deliver some sermons. And we heard some sermons there that were just, you know, hell and brimstone and, you know, you're all going to hell. And so they just didn't know what to do with us at first, right? And one of them finally asked, well, what's this about? And Jan says, well, this is not a self-improvement class. And they went, what? It's not a self-improvement class? Well, why are we here? That's all we do is self-improvement classes, right? And Jan said, no, it's not a self-improvement class, right? And I was looking at them and they were genuinely confused, you know, they were genuinely confused. So I said, well, here's the thing. I said, there was about, I think what, Jan, about 15 women in the room? I said, why don't everybody close their eyes for a minute? So they all closed their eyes. I said, go back to whatever nice memory you can find in your childhood, riding your bike down the street with the wind in your hair, going to the beach with your friends. I don't care what it is. Just go back to a moment in time when you had that feeling, right? So they're all like thinking about it, and you start to see a few smiles come on their faces and everything, right? Not everybody, but most of them. I said, so when you were thinking about that moment back in your childhood, how did that feel? He said, oh, that was lovely. You know, that was really, really nice. Then I asked him a question. I said, can you imagine doing anything to hurt yourself or anybody else when you have that feeling? And 2 or 3 of them started crying. And they said, no, we can't imagine that. I said, well, that's what this class is about, is finding that feeling again. Because if you find that feeling, you won't need the law and the rules to keep you in line. Right? You'll see for yourself how to live this life. And you know, honest to God, I think most of the women in that room truly understood that. They understood that that healthy feeling, that lovely feeling, was the only guide they needed. So that was our first class. And those 3 women were in there just listening. And when we left, there was already a woman in that prison. The reason we ended up there is that we had met her before in a halfway house, and she'd gotten sent back up, so to speak. She was in a car with a boyfriend after she got out of prison. We had met her in a halfway house where we were sharing the principles. And she was in a car with a boyfriend a few months later, and they got pulled over, and there was drugs in the car, so her parole was violated, and she was back in prison. But she somehow had Sid's books in prison, and she was sitting around sharing the principles in the prison yard. This is before we even started, right? And she was writing Sid. She was writing Sid. Somehow she was getting letters through the publisher to Sid. And we came up here. We came up for Christmas, didn't we? Yeah. And Sid said, who's this woman who's writing to me from a prison in Florida, you know? And he wanted us to go see her. and do something for her over Christmas. So I won't go into the whole thing, but we went to see her, and she's the one said, you need to do a program in here. Like, these people are ready for this. And she talked about sharing Sid's books and stuff. And we said, oh, we don't do that. We work in business. And then a couple of weeks later, we were having lunch with an executive, well, actually a CEO that we were working with, and we were telling him about this lunch in prison. And he just goes, go do it. I'll fund it. My company will fund it. Just go do it. So just as an aside, that's how we ended up working in the prisons, right? So anyway, back to, we leave the prison that night, and we know that it was a tough feeling leaving, because we're going home to our comfortable house, and we can pull a steak out of the freezer if we want, and they're living in this absolute hellhole. I mean, absolute hellhole, But in the week that we were away from that first class, all those women started talking about the books and reading the books to each other in the library, right? And we walked in the next day, and this parade of women came in, and 3/4 of them looked so different they were unrecognizable, literally, 3/4 of them. And this one woman, actually 3, but one in particular, the change was stunning. It was, I teared up the second I saw her. I know Jan did too, because she looked so different. She carried herself so differently. It was truly, truly amazing. So we got started in this class, which was either the second or third, I forget. And she told a story. And the story was, she'd been to the class, she'd been reading the books, she sat bolt upright in her bunk one night, in that week that followed, and literally realized how she had created her life, and realized that she could create any life she wanted. Right? And if you don't think that was confusing in that environment to see somebody talk in that way and be in that way, man, you don't know what confusion is, because nobody had ever seen anything remotely like that in that environment, including the other inmates, including the corrections officers, including the warden for that matter. Nobody had ever seen that happen, right? And so an entire prison of women became confused. Right? They did. They became confused. And once they were confused enough, they became extremely curious. And our program started out voluntary. And in 3 weeks, there was a lineup at the door, and a waiting list. Not because of us. Okay? Not because certainly because of the books and Sid's work and so on. Because of the change they saw in those first few women, And that's what we've all been sharing here, that we see that progression. And that's where understanding really spreads. That's how this will be shared with the world. Each one of you that takes it truly into your heart, and I know all of you have, right? And make it your own, and live in that feeling. That's what will change this world. Right? That is what is changing this world. Right? So that progression continues to happen. And like Jacqueline's here, Jacqueline's working in the prison system in England and getting the same kinds of results. The same things are happening. Right? So in that sense, these principles are unstoppable. Right? You can't stop that. Even if you over-intellectualize it, even if you try and make it into the next fancy mousetrap, even if you try to make it, a form of psychology, it doesn't matter if you do all those things. You can't stop the power of true change. You can't stop the power of people seeing other people change at such a profound level. Right? That's where the power is in all of this. I'd like to read a quote from Mr. Banks, if I could. See, I had notes, I told you. So think of those business environments, think of the prison, Think of places where you've worked and listen to this quote. It's a spiritual fact, an absolute spiritual fact that this is heaven. This heaven exists here on earth at all times for any living soul to see and live in, because it's from here that all living things are manifest. The title of this school was Sharing and Living the Principles with Simplicity. I don't see how you get more simple than that. That is a description of what happened in all of those environments, all the environments that you work in. That's a description of what occurred. Think of that woman waking up in her bunk in prison. It's a spiritual fact, an absolute spiritual fact that this heaven exists here on earth at all times for any living soul to see and live in, because it's from here that all living things are manifest.